Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Wednesday, July 8th, 2020, and today we're going to be taking a look at the top 3 Senate elections for both the GOP and the Democratic Party. So this was actually a member-decided video. If you want to know how you can go ahead and get one of your own, you can go ahead and check out the join button right next to my subscribe button on my channel. It'll outline pretty much everything and just give you a general idea of how it all works. But today's video is pretty much going to be, it's really relevant, so I've decided to go ahead and do this one. I think that it is important to note that I will not be using for the Democratic Party, important races. I won't necessarily be using some races that have Democratic incumbents. One of them does, but looking at the true toss-up map, we have around 13, and 12 out of those 13 have Republican incumbents. So if the Democrats are to have any competitive races, it usually will be with a Republican incumbent or against a Republican incumbent. For example, Cory Gardner in Colorado, John Hickenlooper, though the favorite to win the race, he is not the incumbent Democrat running. So we have 45 Democratic seats and 42 Republican seats that I consider to be safe, meaning they either don't have an election up or the races are not going to be competitive in 2020. I know it's surprising seeing states such as Virginia and Minnesota and New Mexico and New Hampshire as safe states, but I've since moved those states over into the safe column after I've assessed a lot of the speculation about GOP candidates in those races, who the nominees are more than likely going to be, and performance in the past for Republicans, and there is no real clear indicator that these races will be even remotely competitive. So we have 13 toss-up seats. We can go ahead and characterize. We're only characterizing 6 of these, 3 of them for important for the Democratic Party and 3 of them important for the GOP. And I'll give a reasoning as to why I classify each one as important. But we can actually go ahead and start with the Democratic seats, and then I'll fill in the Republican seats because I just think it'll be easier that way. Just because of the fact that these are all Republican seats, and then we can actually get to the important Republican seats, which are going to be much more impactful for the GOP, looking at their performance in those individual states than the Democrats' performance in these states. So the first state I would say is important for the Democratic Party is the state of Michigan. Now, though Michigan did vote for Donald Trump in 2016, Debbie Stabenow won the Senate election in 2018. Their governors won the governor's mansion, flipped it from red to blue in 2018. They made pickups in the House of Representatives here. So when we're looking at Michigan itself, it does have a pretty, number one, it has a very Democratic history. It's voted with the Democratic Party up until Donald Trump for around 3 decades. And in 2012, Obama and Biden were both on the ballot, and it was a pretty substantial victory for the Democratic Party. Donald Trump didn't even come close in his margin. It was a 0.27% margin, less than half a percentage point. And, that victory, though, he did win all 16 electoral votes because it is a winner-take-all state. Michigan is not necessarily a Republican state all of a sudden. It hasn't had a dramatic change in heart. It was just more so a failed candidate on the Democratic side, and Donald Trump's new type of campaign styling that the Democrats couldn't even compare to in 2016. So when I call this race important, I mean that the Democratic Party should perform very well here. And it is important to look at their performance here, because if they aren't performing well here, that could be very bad news for other Rust Belt states, not only now, but in the future. Because Michigan right now has a Democrat incumbent, so you have the factor of the incumbency. He's mildly popular. You have a Republican candidate that won this state in the past that is now losing by larger margins than 2016 in the polls, which means if you do adjust based off the numbers that were wrong in 2016, Joe Biden still wins Michigan. So if Biden is able to win Michigan and the down ballot voters don't elect Gary Peters again to the United States Senate, that could be warning sign number 1 for Democratic support erosion in the state of Michigan, which is why I classify it as an important state for the Democratic Party. The next state I would classify as important is the state of Colorado. It's not necessarily in the same region as the Rust Belt, but it does give us a general indicator of how this entire Sun Belt, southwestern region, of the United States is going to perform in the future. Colorado is supposed to be a Democratic state. Voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, Obama in 2012, and 2008, even though it narrowly went to George Bush in 2004. So Colorado did narrow up in 2016, but it's expected widely to go to Joe Biden. Some data indicates that Biden could have as large as a 17-point victory in this state. And yes, there is a Republican incumbent, but he's extremely unpopular, and right now John Hickenlooper is a former governor. So if he isn't performing well here, and let's say the Democrats have a lackluster performance in Colorado, it could spell out bad news not only in Colorado, but in New Mexico in future midterm elections, in Texas. Maybe it's not going to be a swing state as early, Arizona, which we'll get to soon. So Colorado, I think, is actually a good indicator state for the Democratic Party because they should absolutely win this seat. The same thing in Michigan, but if they don't, then it's going to be bad news for them, not only now again, but in future elections. So the final state I think is important for the Democratic Party is the state of Maine. The northeastern region of the United States has always been, the best area for the Democratic Party. A lot of top Democratic officials come out of there. Chuck Schumer, Bernie Sanders, AOC, a lot of notable Democratic names are from the northeastern region. And the fact that Susan Collins, who went from being the most popular senator 4 years ago to now the most unpopular senator, yes, her disapproval rating is higher than Mitch McConnell's and her approval rating is lower. Maine has a Senate election up, and Susan Collins is running against who's more than likely going to be the nominee, Sarah Gideon. And I do think that this race will be a great indicator for Democrats. Just because there's a Republican incumbent, she's unpopular, number one. Her voting record does not align with the voting push from Maine voters. So she is taking a little bit more of a partisan stance than she has in the past. The main reason why Susan Collins never had a competitive race is because she's been the bipartisan senator. She has since lost that title, especially after her Kavanaugh vote. I think that's what the final nail in the coffin was for her. So Maine, I think, will be a very good indicator as to the Democratic Party support in that state. The Democratic Party is expected to outperform their 2016 margin. And, Joe Biden outperformed Sarah Gideon in a lot of the data. Again, that largely has to do with the fact that Susan Collins still retains a pretty significant portion of her once 68% base of the state. So a lot of her support she has lost, but she still holds on to the majority of it, but it may not be enough to push her over the top. So Maine, I think, will give Democrats a general idea of how they're going to perform there. If the Senate election isn't going too well, they still could be winning in the presidential election in Maine, but both of which should be going to the Democratic Party by the end of the evening, or at least whenever they count the mail-in ballots. So 10 toss-up states. We only have 3 to actually classify as important for the Republican Party. So we're going to go ahead and classify races that I don't think are going to be too important, and then we're going to talk about the ones I think are important. So Alaska, which has been discussed fairly recently, public policy polling is expected to do a poll there. I believe they actually conducted it yesterday. But besides that, I will say that Alaska is not too important for the Republican Party and their future performance. It's not an electoral college heavy state. It's not super important to, balance of power. And yes, while the race may be close, that largely has to do with Dan Sullivan, not the race changing or not the state itself changing fundamentally in favor of the Democratic Party. So Alaska, I don't think is too important for the GOP. Nor do I think Montana with incumbent Republican Steve Daines, just because he has a competitive race does not mean that this race is in any way a future indicator for the GOP. There's no regional loss for the GOP here, even if they do lose this Senate race, so I don't think it's important. Kansas, I also do not think is important either. Yes, Chris Kobach could be a bad nominee, but again, just because it's one-off competitive race, you can almost guarantee that Kansas will flip back to the GOP following those 6 years if Barbara Boyer is winning the election there. Another race that I don't think is going to be a huge indicator for Republicans is Alabama or Kentucky. These are 2 states that have a very solid Republican voting history, and it would not be a surprise if the GOP won either of those races. So that goes into the Republican column. And the final state that I'm going to classify as not important for the GOP, which pretty much gives you an idea of which states I will be classifying as important: Arizona, Iowa, and North Carolina. Georgia, I'm going to classify as not super important. Yes, it could be a very good indicator as to the competitive nature of Georgia in the future, but I do really think that North Carolina would better reflect that. North Carolina and Georgia have roughly the same voting history, and while both of which, North Carolina may be narrower than Georgia, I think that's the main reason why it's important for the GOP to go ahead and hold North Carolina, because they had a pretty substantial victory in North Carolina in 2016. They won it in 2012. Obama only was able to carry it by 14,000 votes in his landslide victory in 2008. So North Carolina, I think, is going to be a good indicator for Republican support in the future. It's not too conservative that it won't even vote for the Democratic Party in 2020. Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. But I will say that the Republican Party could very well be losing that 4% edge they have over the Democrats. And if North Carolina goes, it's the start of a number of other southern states turning in favor of the Democratic Party. So since I'm talking about North Carolina a lot, I'm going to classify North Carolina first. Again, this is a very good regional indicator as to the direction of the South in the future, a state with a growing African-American population, with increased African-American and Democratic turnout and voter enrollment. I will say that North Carolina could be a very important race for the GOP, because if they're losing here on election day, and let's say Donald Trump is somehow able to carry the state on the presidential level, while the White House may not be too difficult if North Carolina doesn't go to the Democratic Party, the Senate elections in the future are going to be mildly difficult as well, because North Carolina does have a changing demographic, and it's favoring the Democratic Party. Another state I consider to be important is Arizona. Much like Colorado, would give a very good explanation for the regional shifts in the southwestern region of the United States. These entire states, including Utah and Texas, the entire area that I'm hovering over, have since moved in favor of the Democratic Party since previous elections. Not just because Evan McMullin was running in Utah, but this entire area is seeing an influx of Latino voters. And they typically split for Democrats 70-30. So while the split in it may not be as beneficial for the Democrats as the African American vote, it still benefits them. And Arizona and Texas and Colorado are all expected to gain electoral votes following the 2020 census. So I do think that Arizona is important for the GOP. They're running an incumbent here. While she is underwater in this state, a year ago I would have said that this race is also important. We are talking about a state that hasn't voted for the Democratic Party since '96. And if it votes for the Democrats in this Senate election, though it did in 2018, it's a very quick and very early change for the state of Arizona. It was expected to, flip later on, but it seems to be super competitive now, especially on that presidential level and even more so on the Senate level. So if the GOP is losing here, they probably have completely lost their grip on this entire region, except for Texas, which could be the next one to go. And the final state I would characterize is Iowa. Now, I know it's surprising seeing Iowa characterized, even though this race I still classify as a tilt GOP state. I do think that it is important. This state voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in 2016, and if the Republicans can't even win a Senate race with a Republican incumbent, despite Donald Trump expecting to carry the state on the presidential level, that's more of an indicator of the GOP, because once Trump's out of the way, this state very well could revert back to its Democratic history. We saw what happened in 2018 when some of these voters were angry at President Trump. 3 Democrats went in there were 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat following 2018, and it completely flipped. The Republicans now have a 3-1, a 75% control of the U.S. congressional delegation from Iowa. And that's not just a coincidence. I mean, the Republican Party did start to loosen their grip in the state of Iowa. The governor election narrowed down. In 2016, sure, Donald Trump had an overwhelming victory, but a lot of that had to do with President Trump and Hillary Clinton's, candidacy and just her as a candidate herself, which means the Republican Party, if they aren't able to win this Senate election and Trump somehow wins it on the presidential level, Trump could be very well the only reason why Republicans are going to win that race in the presidential level, and obviously he can't run after 2020. So, I mean, he could, but that's only if he lost. So I do think Iowa would be a good indicator for the GOP and their hold on that region in the United States. Maybe they will be able to narrowly fend it off, but only time will tell. So we'll see this in November, and we'll compare it to this, not necessarily this map, this isn't a prediction map, but this just gives us the races that I will be intently looking at after 2020. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Please consider subscribing on the left if you haven't already, and checking out our Instagram and Twitter. I also have a video on the screen you can go ahead and check out, and then a playlist for my 2020 Senate election video, so you can go and check those out as well. Again, thank you all for watching this video. Please consider joining as a member on my channel, and I will see you all later today.